The spring sun shone brightly over Westbridge University's main quad that Thursday afternoon. Students sprawled on the fresh-cut grass, some with books open on their laps, others chatting in small groups. The air felt light with the promise of summer, but today wasn't just any ordinary day on campus. James Cooper walked across the quad with his backpack slung over one shoulder, running through his talking points in his head. At 19, he stood tall with a slight build, his dark eyes thoughtful behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wasn't someone who typically sought the spotlight. Most days, you'd find him tucked away in the library's quiet corner, surrounded by books on international policy. But today was different. The university was hosting its annual public debate on immigration policy, and James had signed up to speak. As the son of Ghanaian immigrants who had come to America 25 years ago with nothing but hope and determination, this topic wasn't just academic to him, it was personal. "Hey James, ready for your big moment?" called out Lai, his roommate, jogging to catch up. James grinned, but his eyes gave away his nervousness. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." "You'll do great," Lai said, slapping him on the back. "Just remember to breathe." They approached the center of the quad where rows of chairs had been set up facing a small stage with a podium and microphone. Professor Harding, a silver-haired woman from the political science department, was setting up her notes at the moderator's table. James spotted his friends Tanya and David saving seats in the front row. "Look at this turnout," Lai whispered. The chairs were filling quickly. Students, professors, and community members mingled together. James noticed local reporters setting up cameras. His mouth went dry. When he'd volunteered to speak about his family's immigration experience, he hadn't expected such a crowd. He checked his watch, 15 minutes until the debate began. He made his way to the speakers area, where 5 other students were already gathered. There was Raj from the Conservative Students Association, Elena representing the Progressive Alliance, Tyler from the Economics Honor Society, and 2 others James recognized from his classes. "Good crowd," Raj commented, looking nervous despite his usual confidence. Elena nodded. "Did you see? Some people from town showed up too." James glanced where she pointed and noticed a group of older people sitting together, looking somewhat out of place among the students. One woman in particular caught his eye, maybe in her 50s, with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the gathering crowd with obvious disapproval. Professor Harding approached the speakers. "Remember, this is about civil discourse. Each of you gets 5 minutes, followed by questions. We respect all viewpoints here, even those we disagree with." She smiled encouragingly at James. "You're up third." James wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. He'd practiced his speech countless times, but the butterflies in his stomach were doing somersaults now. The debate began. Raj spoke first about border security and legal immigration channels. The crowd listened respectfully, though James noticed some students shaking their heads. Then Elena took the podium, advocating for more compassionate policies. As she spoke about dreamers and family separations, the blonde woman James had noticed earlier crossed her arms tightly across her chest. Then it was James's turn. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. He spotted his friends giving him thumbs up. He took a deep breath. "My name is James Cooper," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I was born in Detroit, but my story begins before that, when my parents left Ghana in search of education and opportunity." He shared how his father had worked night shifts at a gas station while studying for his medical degree, how his mother had cleaned houses until she earned her teaching certificate. He spoke about their belief in America's promise and how they taught him that with privilege comes responsibility. "Immigration isn't just about policies on paper," James continued, gaining confidence. "It's about real people with dreams and contributions to make. My dad now saves lives as a cardiologist. My mom has taught hundreds of kids to read." As he spoke, he noticed the blonde woman shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her face growing increasingly flushed. He had no idea that in a few minutes, her words would change everything about this ordinary spring day on campus, and that his response would be anything but ordinary. James continued his speech, his voice growing stronger with each word. The crowd listened intently as he shared stories about his parents' journey. The gentle spring breeze carried his words across the quad, and even students who had just been passing by stopped to listen. My parents taught me that America isn't perfect, James said, looking out at the diverse faces before him. But it's a place where people from anywhere can build something meaningful if given the chance. The blonde woman, Karen Whitfield, shifted in her seat again. She had come to the debate after seeing a flyer at her local coffee shop. As a longtime resident of the small college town, she often complained about how the university brought too many outsiders to the community. She hadn't planned to attend until she saw the topic was immigration. Karen's face grew increasingly red as James spoke. She clutched her purse tightly on her lap, knuckles whitening. The young man beside her noticed her agitation and edged slightly away. Immigration has shaped America since its founding, James continued. My story is just one of millions. Each immigrant family brings unique gifts, perspectives, and dreams. Professor Harding nodded approvingly from her seat at the moderator's table. In her 30 years of teaching, she'd organized many campus debates, but something about James's genuine delivery made this one special. In the front row, Tanya whispered to David, "He's knocking it out of the park." David nodded, recording the speech on his phone for their student newspaper. As James began discussing current immigration policies, Karen's breathing quickened. She remembered her father's complaints about foreigners taking jobs and her uncle's warnings about changing neighborhood character. These beliefs had been passed down like family heirlooms, rarely questioned or examined. We need to consider the human cost of restrictive policies, James said. Behind every statistic is a family making painful choices, often fleeing conditions we can hardly imagine. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She'd come expecting to hear arguments about border security and legal processes, not this personal appeal that made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. The discomfort transformed into defensiveness, then anger. Around the quad, the audience was captivated. Professor Huang from the history department took notes for her class. A group of international students nodded in recognition of their own experiences. Even Rage, who had argued for stricter border controls, seemed thoughtful. James was approaching his conclusion. My parents always say they're grateful to America for opportunities, but America should also be grateful for what immigrants bring. This exchange makes us all richer, not just economically, but culturally and spiritually. That was when Karen stood up, unable to contain herself any longer. The sudden movement drew all eyes to her rigid figure. "Excuse me," she said loudly, though James hadn't finished speaking. Professor Harding frowned and leaned toward her microphone. "Ma'am, please hold questions until the end." But Karen was beyond social niceties now. 20 years of unexamined beliefs and fear pushed the words out of her mouth before she could reconsider. "Why don't you just go back to Africa if America is so terrible?" she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The crowd froze. Someone gasped. A girl in the back row covered her mouth in shock. James stood at the podium, momentarily stunned. The microphone captured his sharp intake of breath. Lai half rose from his seat, anger flashing across his face. Tanya grabbed his arm, pulling him back down, her eyes never leaving James at the podium. Professor Harding quickly stood up. "That's completely inappropriate," she began, but James raised his hand. "It's okay, Professor," he said quietly into the microphone. "I'd like to respond." The tension in the quad was palpable. More phones came out to record what was happening. A campus security officer at the edge of the crowd took a few steps closer. Karen remained standing, slightly swaying, as if surprised by her own outburst. The man next to her had moved even further away, visibly embarrassed to be sitting near her. James took a deep breath, adjusting his glasses. The entire crowd leaned forward, wondering what this soft-spoken student would say to such a blatantly racist attack. No one expected what came next. James looked directly at Karen, his expression not angry but calm and collected. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere. Later, many would recall this as the exact second when an ordinary campus debate transformed into something they would remember for years to come. The silence that followed Karen's outburst seemed to stretch for an eternity. Time slowed down in the quad as hundreds of eyes darted between the middle-aged woman still standing rigidly and James at the podium. The gentle rustle of leaves in the spring breeze was now the loudest sound. James's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the podium. He had experienced moments like this before, smaller ones, perhaps, but carrying the same sting. A comment in a grocery store when he was 12. A teacher's surprised tone when he aced an advanced math test. The way some people clutched their bags closer when he entered an elevator. But never so public, never so raw. Karen's face had transformed from angry to something more complex, a mixture of defiance and growing awareness that she had crossed a line. Still, she remained standing, chin raised slightly, as if committed to her position. Professor Harding reached for the moderator's microphone again. "This debate is about civil discourse," she began firmly. "Personal attacks have no place." "Professor," James interrupted gently, his voice surprisingly steady. "If it's okay with you, I'd like to respond directly." The professor looked uncertain but nodded, respecting his choice. James took a sip of water from the bottle beside his notes. The crowd was so quiet you could hear the water going down his throat. He looked directly at Karen, and what happened next shocked everyone. He smiled. Not a mocking smile or an angry one, just a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was somehow more powerful than any angry response could have been. "Ma'am," he began, voice clear and calm, "I was born in Detroit. My birth certificate says Henry Ford Hospital. I've never actually been to Africa, though it's definitely on my bucket list." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back whispered, "Is he for real?" "But I'd be happy to talk about Africa, since you brought it up," James continued. "It's a continent with 54 countries, thousands of languages, and some of the oldest civilizations on Earth." Karen blinked, clearly surprised by his measured response. She had expected, perhaps even wanted, anger, which would have confirmed some beliefs she held. This calm, educational approach left her without a script. "My parents came from Ghana," James explained. "It's a country with a deep democratic tradition. Before colonization, the Ashanti Kingdom had a constitution that limited the king's power, kind of like our checks and balances system." A professor from the history department nodded appreciatively from her seat. Several students who had been poised to intervene now watched in fascination. "When people say go back to Africa, I always wonder which part they mean," James continued, his voice gaining confidence. "The part where humans first evolved. The part with ancient libraries at Timbuktu that preserved knowledge while Europe was in the Dark Ages. Or maybe the part that developed mathematical concepts we still use today." Karen slowly sank back into her chair. Her face had lost its redness, replaced by a puzzled expression. This wasn't going how she had imagined. James gestured with his hands as he spoke, his passion for the topic evident. "There's this idea that people like my parents came to America to take something. But that's not the whole story. They came to exchange, to give and receive. That's how human progress has always worked." Phones remained up, recording every word. A local reporter scribbled frantically in her notebook. This had gone beyond a campus debate. Something remarkable was happening. "So when you suggest I go back," James said, his voice softer now, looking directly at Karen, "you're not just dismissing me, but dismissing the entire history of human migration and cultural exchange that made America possible in the first place." A girl in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. Professor Harding's stern expression had softened to one of pride. Even Rage, who had argued for stricter immigration controls, was nodding slightly. Karen's hands fidgeted in her lap. For perhaps the first time, she was being asked to consider perspectives she had never entertained. Her worldview, built over decades and inherited from generations before her, was facing a gentle but firm challenge from the very person she had tried to dismiss. "But I'm not finished yet," James said, adjusting his glasses, "because there's something important about my family's story that I think might surprise you." The crowd leaned forward as one, captivated by what might come next. No one checked their phones or watches anymore. In that moment, nothing existed outside this unexpected exchange between a student and the woman who had tried to silence him with her words. James took another sip of water, gathering his thoughts. The quad remained silent, the audience waiting for what would come next. He stepped slightly to the side of the podium, making himself more visible, more human, less a speaker and more a storyteller. "My father came to America 30 years ago on a scholarship," James began. "He had exactly $87 in his pocket and 2 changes of clothes in his suitcase. His village in Ghana had pooled their savings to buy his plane ticket. He smiled slightly at the memory. Dad tells me he was terrified when he landed in New York. The buildings were taller than anything he'd ever seen. The pace of life made him dizzy. And the cold, he'd never experienced winter before. Several international students nodded in recognition of that feeling. The first few years were hard, James continued. Dad worked nights at a gas station while studying pre-med during the day. He slept maybe 4 hours a night. His accent was thick then, and some customers mocked him. One night, someone robbed the store and held a gun to his head. Karen's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't the narrative she had expected. But here's what my dad remembers most from those early years, James said, leaning forward slightly. The elderly couple who invited him for Thanksgiving when they learned he'd be alone. The professor who stayed after class to help him with medical terminology. The American roommate who taught him to drive in the snow. He paused, letting the words sink in. When Dad finished medical school, he had offers from hospitals in wealthy areas. Better pay, nicer neighborhoods. But he chose to work at a clinic in rural Kentucky in a county with one of the highest poverty rates in the country. People there hadn't seen a cardiologist in years. The local reporter's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. This story was taking an unexpected turn. The first week, patients would see him and ask for a different doctor, James said. Some used words I won't repeat here. But Dad just kept showing up, kept treating everyone with the same care. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, a habit he picked up from his father. 3 years later, when Dad got sick with pneumonia, his waiting room filled with people bringing food. Farmers, coal miners, teachers, the same community that once rejected him now considered him family. They wouldn't let my mom do a single load of laundry until he recovered. James looked directly at Karen now, who had completely lost her defensive posture and was listening intently. That's the America my parents taught me about. Not perfect, never perfect, but capable of growth. Capable of seeing beyond first impressions and stereotypes. A place where relationships can transform prejudice better than any law or policy. Professor Harding dabbed at her eye with a tissue. Lily gave a small fist pump from his seat. Even the campus security guard had moved closer to hear better. My mom's story is similar, James continued. She cleaned houses while earning her teaching degree. Now she teaches 3rd grade in Detroit. Many of her students come from tough situations, poverty, broken homes, neighborhoods where gunshots aren't uncommon. He smiled warmly. Every year, Mom buys extra school supplies with her own money. She comes in early to help kids with reading. Last Christmas, she and Dad anonymously paid off lunch debts for the entire school. James adjusted his glasses. Mom keeps a quote on her classroom wall from Dr. King, "Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." She believes every child in her class can change the world, regardless of where they or their parents came from. The contrast between these stories and Karen's hostile comment hung in the air. No one pointed it out explicitly, they didn't need to. So when you suggest I go back to Africa, James said, his voice gentle but firm, I have to wonder if you really understand what my family has given to this country. Not taken, given. Karen looked down at her hands, her face unreadable. My parents chose America, James continued. They chose to invest their talents, dreams, and futures here. They chose to raise me with both African values and American possibilities. They chose to serve communities that many others avoid. He straightened his shoulders slightly. I stand here today as the son of immigrants, but also as an American who believes deeply in this country's potential. Not because it's perfect, but because at our best, we keep trying to live up to our ideals even when we fall short. James paused, looking around at the faces watching him. Something powerful was happening in this space, something beyond the planned debate topic. Hearts were opening, minds were shifting. And I'm just getting started, he said with quiet confidence. James stepped back to the podium, his initial nervousness long gone. Something had shifted in him during these tense minutes. The debate had become more than an academic exercise. It was now about connecting human to human. I mentioned earlier that I'd like to talk about Africa, since you brought it up, James said, his voice stronger now. Most people don't learn much about African history in school. I didn't either, until my grandmother started telling me bedtime stories. He smiled at the memory. When I was 8, While other kids were reading fairy tales, my grandmother told me about Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, who was likely the richest person in history. His pilgrimage to Mecca in the 1300s was so lavish that he gave away so much gold it caused inflation in every city he visited. A few history students nodded, familiar with the story. Others looked surprised. She told me about the libraries of Timbuktu, where scholars preserved thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine during Europe's Dark Ages. About the Kingdom of Exum, which developed its own written language and accepted Christianity before many European nations. Karen remained still in her seat, her expression a mixture of discomfort and reluctant interest. Africa isn't just lions and zebras, James continued. It's the birthplace of humanity. The earliest evidence of mathematics comes from the Ishango bone found in Congo, a 20,000-year-old counting tool. The world's first mining operations were in Swaziland 43,000 years ago. Professor Huang from the history department was nodding enthusiastically, clearly impressed by the impromptu lecture. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco was founded by a woman in 859 AD and is the oldest continuously operating university in the world, James said. For context, Oxford wouldn't be established for another 200 years. He glanced down at his debate notes but set them aside. He didn't need them anymore. When we reduce Africa to stereotypes, we erase this rich history. When people say "go back to Africa" as an insult, they're speaking from ignorance about a continent that gave the world its first mathematical concepts, architectural marvels, and sophisticated governance systems. The whole Quad was completely silent. Even the birds seemed to be listening. But African contributions aren't just in the distant past, James continued. Today, Kenya has one of the world's most innovative mobile payment systems. Nigeria's film industry, Nollywood, produces more movies annually than Hollywood. Ethiopian scientists are developing drought-resistant crops that could help feed millions. A slight breeze rustled through the trees, cooling the warm spring air. No one moved. And here in America, African immigrants are making history too, James said. They're among the most educated immigrant groups in the country. They start businesses at higher rates than the general population. They serve as doctors, engineers, teachers, and yes, even politicians. He looked directly at Karen again, his expression not angry but earnest. When my parents came here, they'd brought their culture, their work ethic, their dreams. They didn't diminish America, they enhanced it. That's the story of immigration throughout our history. Italian food, German Christmas traditions, Irish music, Chinese innovations, all now considered American because we're a nation built on cultural exchange. Karen's hands had unclenched in her lap. Something in her rigid posture had softened almost imperceptibly. The Africa you told me to go back to, it's already here, James said, gesturing around him. It's in the coffee you might have had this morning, originally from Ethiopia. It's in the jazz music born from African rhythms. It's in the architectural techniques used in the Capitol building. It's woven into the American story, just like contributions from every corner of the world. Professor Harding checked her watch, amazed that nearly 15 minutes had passed since Karen's outburst. No one had interrupted. No one wanted to break the spell of James's words. I'm proud of my African heritage, James continued, his voice warm with emotion. And I'm equally proud to be American. These identities don't conflict, they complement each other. They make me who I am. He paused, looking around at the captivated faces. So when someone tells me to go back to Africa, I don't hear an insult. I hear an opportunity to share what Africa truly is, what it has given the world, and how its legacy lives on in every corner of America, including right here, right now, in this conversation we're having. The sun had shifted slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the quad. But no one seemed to notice the passing time. They were waiting for what would come next. James looked around the quad, noticing how the mood had transformed. What had begun as a standard university debate had become something much more meaningful. He could feel it in the air. A shared moment of connection that transcended the usual academic discussions. I want to tell you about something that happened last year, James said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I was volunteering at a free health clinic my dad helps run on weekends. Most patients there don't have insurance. They're working multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. He leaned against the podium slightly, as if sharing a story with friends rather than addressing a crowd. An older white gentleman came in with chest pains. When he saw my dad, he asked for a different doctor. Used some words I won't repeat here. James shook his head. My dad just smiled and said, "I'm the only cardiologist here today, sir. But I promise you're in good hands." Karen shifted in her seat, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. The man didn't have much choice, so he reluctantly agreed to be examined, James continued. Dad discovered he was having a minor heart attack and needed immediate surgery. He called the hospital personally to get the man admitted right away, even though we were swamped with other patients. The campus had grown even quieter. Someone had turned off a lawnmower in the distance, as if even the groundskeeper was listening. 3 weeks later, that same man came back to the clinic. I was working at the front desk, James said. He asked for my dad, and I worried he was coming to complain. Instead, he was carrying a homemade apple pie. He told me, "Your father saved my life when a lot of people were shown me the door." Several people in the audience nodded, some wiping away tears. That man now volunteers at the clinic, helping with paperwork and driving patients who can't get there on their own, James said. He and my dad have become friends. They go fishing together sometimes. James looked directly at Karen, his expression gentle. That's the power of human connection. One conversation, one interaction at a time. That's how real change happens. Not through policies alone, but through relationships that challenge our assumptions about each other. Karen's eyes were fixed on James now, her earlier hostility replaced by something more complex, a mixture of embarrassment and reluctant respect. My mom has similar stories from her classroom, James continued. Last parent-teacher conference, a father came in angry about his daughter being paired with a student who didn't speak much English. He complained it would hold his child back. James smiled. Mom invited him to visit the classroom the next day. He watched as his daughter taught her partner English words, while her partner taught her Spanish. By the end of the month, both girls had improved in both languages, and the families now have dinner together regularly. He adjusted his glasses. These small bridges between people, they're being built every day, all across America. Not in Congress or on the news, but in classrooms, clinics, neighborhoods, and workplaces. Professor Harding watched with pride as her student transformed a moment of ugliness into something profound. This was why she had become an educator for moments like this. I understand the fear behind words like "go back where you came from," James said, his voice compassionate rather than accusatory. Change can be scary. Difference can be uncomfortable. It's human nature to worry about losing what we value. He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. But America has always been changing. That's our strength, not our weakness. The America my parents fell in love with wasn't static. It was alive with possibility. It was a place where different cultures, ideas, and dreams could come together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The sun had shifted position, casting golden afternoon light across the quad. It illuminated James's face as he spoke, giving his words an almost ethereal quality. We don't need to fear each other's differences, he said. We can be curious about them. We can learn from them. We can recognize that our diversity of thought, culture, experience makes us stronger, more innovative, more compassionate as a nation. He paused, looking directly at Karen again. So instead of telling me to go back to Africa, I'd like to invite you to come forward into a conversation about who we are as Americans and who we want to become. Because that conversation needs everyone's voice, including yours. The invitation hung in the air, sincere and unexpected. No one moved. All eyes turned to Karen, waiting for her response. For several long seconds, the only sound in the quad was the rustling of leaves in the spring breeze. Karen stood frozen, all eyes on her. Her face had lost its earlier anger, replaced by something more vulnerable. Uncertainty, perhaps even shame. Slowly, she reached for her purse. Several people tensed, unsure what would happen next. Karen pulled out a tissue and dabbed at her eyes. She began, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't know what to say. James' expression remained kind. You don't have to say anything right now. Sometimes it's enough just to listen. Karen nodded, then surprised everyone by walking toward the podium. Professor Harding moved as if to intercept her, concerned about another confrontation, but stopped when she saw Karen's body language. Head slightly bowed, shoulders relaxed. When Karen reached the front, she looked up at James. "I've never heard anyone talk about these things the way you do," she said quietly, though the microphone picked up her words. "No one's ever answered me like that before." James stepped away from the podium, creating a more personal space for conversation. "Most people respond to anger with more anger," he said. "It's understandable, but it rarely changes anything." "My father used to say those exact words," Karen admitted, a look of surprise crossing her face. "About immigrants, I mean. He lost his factory job when I was young. He blamed people from other countries." James nodded. "That must have been hard for your family." "It was," she said. "We struggled for years. I guess I've been carrying that anger ever since, without really thinking about it." A few rows back, Lai whispered to Tanya, "Is this really happening?" She shushed him, not wanting to break the moment. "I'm not saying you need to change your mind about immigration policy," James told Karen. "Reasonable people can disagree about how borders should work, but maybe we can separate the policies from the people. See each other as humans first." Karen nodded slowly. "I've never met your parents, but they sound like good people. Better than me coming here and causing a scene." "They'd probably say we're all works in progress," James replied with a small smile. "My dad always tells me that the measure of a person isn't never making mistakes, it's how you respond when you realize you've made one." The quad had become so silent you could hear birds singing in distant trees. No one moved, no one checked their phones. Something remarkable was unfolding before them. "I'm sorry," Karen said, the words clearly difficult for her. "What I said was wrong. I was angry about things that have nothing to do with you." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the crowd. Professor Harding wiped away a tear, not bothering to hide her emotion anymore. "Thank you," James said simply. "Would you like to stay for the rest of the debate? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, your real thoughts, not just reactions." Karen hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'd like that." As she returned to her seat, something unexpected happened. A student offered her a bottle of water. Another scooted over to make more room for her. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. Professor Harding approached the microphone. "I think we've witnessed something today that goes beyond academic debate," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is what education is truly about, not just exchanging ideas, but growing as human beings." She turned to James. "Would you like to finish your original presentation? We've gone off schedule, but I think everyone wants to hear what you have to say." James shook his head. "Actually, I think I've said what matters most." He looked around at the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "Instead, maybe we could open the floor for questions and conversation, not just about policies, but about our experiences, our fears, our hopes." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Professor Harding agreed. For the next hour, something magical happened on the quad. Students, professors, and community members, including Karen, shared stories they'd never told before. People who had entered with firm opinions found themselves listening with new openness. Political opponents found unexpected common ground. As the event finally wound down, a student reporter approached James. "That was incredible," she said. "How did you stay so calm when she attacked you like that?" James thought for a moment. "I remembered something my grandmother always says. When someone throws stones at you, you can throw them back, or you can use them to build something. Today felt like a good day for building." The video of the exchange went viral that night. Not because it showed conflict, but because it showed something far rarer and more precious, a moment of genuine human connection across a divide that had seemed unbridgeable just hours before.